My name is Gail Low, and I'm from the Writing Practice Center program at the University of Dundee. And we're really delighted to have Sara Hunt from Saraband. Now, Saraband is a publisher, is a publisher that used to be in Glasgow and still has Scottish roots in the country. It's an independent publisher based in Manchester now. Sara's moved a couple of years ago, actually more than a couple of years ago, but still has strong links with Scotland. Now, the company was formed in 1994, but I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit about the history of the company. And it's actually, it produces beautifully produced books. I think the covers are really lovely. It's got a whole tradition in literary fiction as well as non-fiction. And of course, in 2014, it started its own crime fiction imprint called Contraband. Sara founded Saraband in 1994 as a content creator, what's known in trade as a packager, a book packager. But I'll let you maybe let you say something about how you started. So I'm going to kick off with some questions, and we want this to be interactive. So if you want to ask a question, even while we're talking, just stick your hands up, and we'll actually kind of incorporate you into the discussion. So Sara, I wanted to ask you a couple of things, first of all. And these are just kind of ways to think about why you started what you've done, essentially. So my question, first of all, is what made you enter publishing, and how you set up the firm, and how you actually started? And actually, we had that discussion a little bit at lunchtime, whether you would do it today.
Thank you very much, Gail, for that kind introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming along this afternoon. That was several more questions than my memory could retain in one go. So I'm going to start with why I entered publishing, which I would imagine would hold for everybody in this room, or quite likely so. It was because I, from the very earliest age, absolutely loved reading and loved books in every way. It was just something I always had a passion for. And growing up at the school I went to valued the usual things that schools do. The more academic, the better, and the more things like medicine and law and so on were the things that they tried to steer people into as far as possible. And so I didn't go the conventional route of English lit and so on. I remained an avid reader in my own time, but was never really sure what kind of a career I might have, because nobody had, in any sense, ever shown me a model of how to get into publishing. I grew up a long, long way from London, and publishing seemed as remote as, say, careers on TV might have at the time. But, so I studied philosophy at university, which was never really a career move, obviously, but I enjoyed it. And I wanted to do a career that I would enjoy, but the only ones that presented themselves were things like accountancy and civil service and blah, blah, blah. And just nothing ever appealed other than books and reading and writing and so on. So when I graduated, I went to the London College of Printing, which I think at the time was the only place to offer a kind of vocational way into publishing. And they had a postgraduate diploma, and that gave me a start. And at that point, I had managed to find out from various people who were in publishing, or knew people in publishing, that the career entry methods at the time were not really any more attractive than they are now. And most often people going into editorial would start in secretarial positions, especially women, and then spend years photocopying and all sorts of things, and gradually work their way up through a kind of apprentice system. But someone suggested to me trying going in through production, which I did. And I know a number of other people who did that too, and actually I think it's quite good because you do learn a lot of the practical sides, and it's demystified for you, and it's probably simpler to get your head around that now because everybody can do forms of their own instant publishing, and so production looks a bit less scary or alien. But for me, I had a job. There were no unpaid internships at the time, but there were almost no ways in unless you had contacts. So I got in a production job, and then after a couple of jobs, I worked at Penguin, and one of my colleagues in production there was Jeremy Trevathan, who's a publishing director at Pan Macmillan now and has done very well. And I read, I don't know if any of you've seen, there's a publishing newsletter now about women in publishing, and their opening interview was Rebecca Smart, who's the MD of Doyle and Kindersley, and was at Ebury and has done various other jobs, and she also went in through production. So whether that says anything useful or not, it was useful at that time. What was the next question?
Did you have a sense of what kind of press you wanted to start when you started?
No.
Did you? In a way,
I
no.
always wanted to be in publishing, but I didn't have any sense that it would be possible to start your own press because the barriers to entry were just astronomical. You would have needed infrastructure and all sorts of things that, because at the time it was before desktop publishing and the electronic workflows, so it never even entered my head. Simply.
Okay. And when you started, then how did it come about? Essentially, I mean, given all of the hurdles you had, that were put in place even before you started, even before one starts to think about publishing, how did you get into publishing?
So you mean in starting a company as opposed to a job, first job?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so by the time I'd been in publishing for a number of years, and I worked for a company that asked me to go to do a particular job in the States, and by this time I was doing rights and other things and wider than production and kind of looking after editorial as well. And so I went over to New York and really liked it and stayed on, and then I couldn't really stay at the company I was because the job and I had outgrown each other's usefulness. So I started to think, well, practically, it was difficult to freelance as an editor because at the time there was more of an issue between US English and British English, and I didn't really know the right people and so on, and I couldn't really think of a way to combine everything. And also, American employers generally don't give you any leave, which, if you're going to live abroad, you want, I see a smile from an American here, but you want the freedom to be able to go home sometimes, and so I couldn't really think of anything practical, and then I just decided to try going it alone. And so I founded the company, not initially as a full-blown publisher, but dealing with the creative and production sides as a content producer, or it's a lesser known term now, but book packaging. And it's the equivalent of an independent TV production company, say, which will create and commission and create a programme and own the rights in it and so on, but then will approach a broadcaster for that to be broadcast. So we started in illustrated non-fiction, in filling a gap that publishers weren't doing themselves, but books that were popular, reference history, arts, and so on, combining kind of editorial and design and production. And we would commission the book and put it all together and produce it and deliver it to the warehouse, and then collect the contracted amount of money. It was, looking back, a lot easier than full-blown publishing because there wasn't the marketing side to deal with or distribution.
And when you started Saraband, how big was that step from being a book packager and letting all of that other kinds of sales and marketing be handled by somewhere else, or creating content for different publishers? What made you make that step?
So really it started with the way that content was changing in terms of the book market, because this was before there was a very active internet, or any internet. So people would go and buy books or go to the library for books or whatever to just look up basic information. And it feels so prehistoric now that, you know, probably in terms of non-fiction publishing, just the sheer availability of information and facts by going to search engines has been the biggest transformation, because in terms of then non-fiction publishing, there are only certain sorts that make sense anymore. People don't want piles of books in their house just giving them information. So that was really the biggest driver of changing what we were doing. And so gradually we moved away from that kind of content and more into narrative non-fiction. And at a certain point I decided to move back to the UK as well, because just life, it just felt like, you know, I enjoyed being in the States, but this is home. So I came back and I made a decision not to go to London, which shocked quite a few people I knew in publishing, because they just felt that that was frankly just weird, because all of publishing is so centred on London. But I just didn't want to go and do that, and for all kinds of reasons. So gradually it became the skills for that book packages used to provide for larger publishers became less relevant because of the digital transformations, and so we just became more focused on the writing, and then gradually started to think that it was just better to publish it ourselves. And so it was a massively steep learning curve, and we made lots of mistakes, and I wish I had had bookselling experience primarily, because we were much more focused on the creative ends than the marketing end. But you know, we had done very well in the 90s with the non-fiction publishing, and it did give a cushion to be frittered away in the learning of those lessons, which is good.
And did you find, I mean, something that's always kind of interested me is to what extent does the culture, are you, for example, subsidised by Arts Council England? Publishing is so completely tricky to come into now without having massive capital behind you, that a lot of the small presses are part funded by funding agencies, charitable funding agencies, Creative Scotland, kind of also Arts Council England. To what extent, in your trajectory, in your upward trajectory to Saraband, was now a really successful small press, you know, to what extent did that help, or did you have all of that infrastructures?
We've got quite a complicated relationship with funding, in that much more often applied and being turned down than, and I think partly in terms of moving to Scotland as an English person, this is a bit of a difficult thing there, you know, that you have to kind of pay your dues and so on. But inevitably, the more that we became embedded in Scottish writing and history and so on, our list became predominantly Scottish. And there was a short period where we got some Creative Scotland funding, but I would have to say that we never really mastered the art of figuring out how to get that funding. But it changes, and I think that at the moment, Creative Scotland is a very effective mechanism for helping emerging new publishers, and they've got some fantastic new success stories. So the biggest issue for Scottish publishing, I think, in terms of Scottish writing and subjects, is the size of the country and the size of the readership. And in my view, small country publishing it needs funding, because there just isn't enough. There isn't enough margin in book industry for anybody, booksellers or before you even get to paying much to an author. There isn't enough margin for a smallish number of people to be able to fund that book. And I think that Creative Scotland has a very big role to play in supporting Scottish writers, both in their individual projects and also to be published. But curiously, now that our official publishing company is still Scottish, we're registered in Glasgow and some of our admin is there and so on, and it was really because I personally moved down to Manchester for personal reasons to help looking after aging parents. Sorry, Dad, but you are 88. So I only moved away for that, but I am now in a position where we can sort of apply for different kinds of projects, for Scottish projects to the Creative Scotland, and for the northwest of England is in need of lots of cultural support, should we say, and Arts Council England have a good programme as well, and they support publishers in the Northern Fiction Alliance, of which we're a member. So I think it has a huge role to play, because the more that the industry becomes so difficult to self-finance, and the more it's required to have funding.
Now, can I ask you a little bit to tell us about Saraband, the company now? I mean, you are 25 years down the line from where you started, just about. The number of titles you publish, the kinds of things that really kind of drive your ambitions and your vision for the company. I know you do specialize in literary non-fiction as much as literary fiction now. Could you just take us through maybe some of those highlights, those moments in that publishing history?
And so, as I said, we started moving towards narrative non-fiction, and that is our solid foundation of any given year, because non-fiction is much easier to publish in the sense that the market's more predictable and easier to find. And gradually, as you specialise in particular areas, you get to know individual shops or interest groups or people who in some way have a supportive role to play, be it influential people who can offer endorsements or whatever. So we have, I would say, specialised in nature writing, environment, sustainability, that end of things, and we've done some history, and we've done quite a bit of memoir. And I think that all of those things you can bring to market in a way that is sort of straightforwardly subject related. And if you look at all the literary festivals that we have, it's much easier to book an author to appear at a festival if they're going to talk about a non-fiction subject that they're either specialising or have something strong to say. So that is our mainstay, and it's much more predictable how many you might sell and the kind of response you'll get. Fiction is much more difficult. On the one hand, you've got literary fiction, which is very difficult to package up and sell. You know, there are a small number of influencers, critics, and so on who can help with that. But finding a readership is very difficult. But it's exciting to do it. And when we first went into fiction, it really coincided with the moment that digital changes were happening, and more really to do with social media starting up. And so at the very beginning of Twitter, when there weren't many people there, it was really possible to make a noise about anything. And we started out with a novel which in the plot there was a World War II in the Navy theme. It was based on a true story which had been novelised, and it was possible to do small videos for YouTube, and then lots of Twitter tagging, you know, the merchant navy and this thing and that thing, World War II things and so on. And it quickly got sales that way. But and at the same time, all of the barriers to entry in terms of physical, you know, we already had a distribution network and those kinds of things. So it was quite possible to do it. And to kind of to go through this social media route before we had any relationship then with the main critics. So that was a really positive way to begin, and so we sort of carried on. And once you start publishing fiction, it's not possible to stop. It's like an addiction. And then we there was a point at which Scandi Noir was huge, and we sort of looked around and thought, why isn't there a Scottish crime imprint? Because we're sort of northern and very good at noir. So it wasn't necessarily that we thought we must have a specific separately named imprint, but then once the name Contraband came to mind, which was Marion Sinclair's idea, I think, for Publishing Scotland when I was discussing it with her. We had in mind then to try and take advantage of all the talent in Scotland for crime writing and the audience for it, but it was a truism really that crime, as in other genre writing as well, would need huge marketing budgets to make an impact. So, you know, it's generally on the side of the buses and at bus stops and billboards everywhere, and huge amounts of advertising money to get that through to people's attention. And that was obviously never going to happen. So we decided straight away to try to be a little bit different, maybe try to go for things that were not classic, not traditionally thought of as crime novels, or a bit quirky, or maybe that somehow were being overlooked by other publishers, and just to try and build up that way. And so that's how Contraband started.
And of course you had enormous success when his Bloody Project was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Can you talk us through all of that as well, that story?
Yes, well, at the exact moment that we were looking to start Contraband and not really sure what, you know, how to go about soliciting crime novels without getting sort of thousands of ones with very exploitative plots that we didn't really want to do and so on. Graham's first book landed, and it was just a dream come true, because it was such a, I don't know if anybody's read The Disappearance of Adele Bordeaux here, but it's a brilliant book, and so that was book number one. He was one of our first three, and it got a good response from the Scottish literary scene straight away. It was well reviewed in the Herald, and various of the things like the Skinny and the List and so on. And Graham had been, he was in the Scottish Book Trust New Writers Awards programme, and had been a year that he submitted this. So he had already finished at Delbado and was writing the next book. So he had a little bit of, he already had some connections and so on, but it's really difficult to get attention for even the best of writing. And so it happened at the time we had Faber ran a sort of alliance for small presses to do their sales and help with distribution. And so they were our sales team, and one or two of the reps really got behind this book because they loved it so much. So we have modest but, you know, decent for a small press sales on the first book. And then when His Bloody Project came in, and it's just a really brilliant book. We didn't do all that much in the edit. It was sort of put perfectly formed, more or less on arrival. And in a way, it sort of coincided with a slightly tricky time for us because Faber were closing down that alliance and we were sort of moving over. So initially, we didn't actually sell much of it, but the reviews that we did get were obviously very good, and there was a kind of a local buzz, but nothing any further. And you know, we pitched it all over the place to everything as a lead title, but it really is just, you have to be absolutely relentless with literary fiction because you know, the smaller and smaller number of critics that there are and influencers are absolutely barraged with far too much to read. And, you know, it's very difficult for them to pick one thing over another. And so we didn't really, we made a couple of foreign sales, and there was a TV option in agreement and so on, but it really hadn't made any impact south of the border at all. And so when the long listing came about, I mean, it's one of those things that big publishers really gear up to the hour and the moment when the phone calls will come in with the long listings and they're pacing up and down waiting by their phones. And small presses are not even clocking the date because it's a sort of tiny likelihood of a book being on the Booker list. It's just so competitive, and the quality of what they judge is obviously amazing. So it was just an absolutely unbelievable moment, and I really had to, you know, I was trying to get it through to Graham just how huge it was, and what a big difference the long list would make. But that was as nothing to the difference that the shortlisting made. And straight away, that year, the choices that the panel made were very unconventional. The big names were all overlooked, and there were a lot of, you know, unknown names or lesser known names. So immediately that day on front row, they had various literary experts who'd read up on their Julian Barneses and so on, all these ones that were expected to be on the long list, and they didn't really know anything about, apart from I think Deborah Levy, there was almost nobody else you would expect. So we very quickly got this kind of, oh, here's a completely unknown book on a crime imprint, and you know, we immediately got the lion's share of the sort of interesting, you know, plucky little obscure, random, nobody's press, and so we just played up to it because it worked, and then from there, you know, Graham's, the critics were absolutely falling over themselves to praise it. So it was universally very, very highly praised in all of them. The Times, the Sunday Times, the FT, Guardian, Independent Telegraph, all of them. The Telegraph review, I think, was from Jake Kerridge, who is a regular crime author and does quite a bit of literary crime, and he had reviewed it previously. He was the only one who had taken notice before that, and I think that came about because of having his ear bent at Bloody Scotland, if I remember rightly, next to the football game. Does anyone go to Bloody Scotland here? Yes, so. But I think that the sort of our obscurity and so on really helped this kind of narrative of the living the dream, that the unknown author becomes found and so on. And then, it's a very accessible book as well for all its layers. It just way outsold all the others. And Graham is someone who doesn't always enjoy the writing process. He labours over it, every single sentence and word, very carefully. But he actually does love being interviewed, which is the opposite of most authors. He's very good at events and interviews, and so he's really comfortable. He had worked previously in TV as a researcher and producer, so he was really unfazed by all of those kind of things. And it just sort of came together, everything came together for him brilliantly. And from our end, our editorial director is also, he had trained in journalism and PR, so he had PR jobs before joining us, and therefore could immediately kick in and be very good at dealing with all of the PR side of it. And it's all run by Four Getty, Four Communications, I think they're called now, and he worked with them very smoothly, and was constantly being praised for being faster and better and so on than all the big publishers, so that was nice. So it was very unexpected, but all positive.
Sometimes it's said of small publishers don't put their books in for the booker because it's such an expensive process insofar as you're expected to produce kind of thousands of paperbacks just for instance once you hit, if you like, the short list or even the long list, I think. Did you have to think twice about putting it into competition?
Not at all, because as I said at the very beginning, coming from a sort of production background and having, at one point we used to do sort of quite large print runs for co-editions, which was sort of printing several languages at once on one big run of maybe 50,000 plus of a big expensive colour book. So the economics of dealing with a few thousand of a paperback, obviously you can't. It's all relative, but in terms of all the things there are to do and to finance, the production side is not a big expense. I think the issue is that there are some prizes that a small press is very unlikely to get beyond a shortlisting for if they relate to how many, how well the books have sold, if they're slightly more popular genres. But the Booker is supposedly only about the quality of that book in a literary sense, and so there's just nothing to lose. You're bringing a huge positive attention to the book, and I wouldn't think twice about entering for the Booker. The only danger is, and I know that other small presses have struggled with trying to estimate the demand, and if it's a less accessible book, I think the going estimate is that if you're long-listed, you should make 5,000 copies available very quickly, immediately, if they aren't already. And that is potentially difficult if it's not an accessible novel and no one actually is going to read it, even though it's on the long list. And this does happen, and I know I mean, my first reaction was to just get on the phone to everybody I know in the collegiate world of small publishing and just ask them, what did you do, how many did you print for the long list? And then our sales team were extremely helpful as well, and so we did 5,000 there and then, because within about 10 minutes of the list being announced, it's all gone out of stock completely, because it just gets taken straight away by wholesalers. So, and then the main printers have absolutely geared up around the bookers, so they clear space and they're ready to take orders and deliver them very quickly. So the actual mechanics of all of that were not difficult. But the more difficult side of that issue with prizes, I think, is for other prizes that are geared at a more popular audience, say like Costa Prize and so on. They're more for books that have a genuinely proven commercial appeal, and they're often, it's a very crossover literary but accessible. They're not, a small press is very, very unlikely to win one of those, and the cases where it's happened, it's usually been taken over. So a few years ago, Andrew Michael Hurley's The Loney was won the yes, and that was published by a very small imprint, but without the founders of that company having a long history in working in publishing otherwise, and so they were happy to have that brought out by John Murray and Hachette, and they then were able to make it sort of get onto that Costa level. But we've certainly entered prizes where we've had short listings where you pay £1,000 or more, or the book is several thousand, and you can very quickly get through a lot of money that way, and you can very quickly make it help to lose the book more money. But in terms of the booker, it's just a matter of just being the balance between being prudent about not going mad and then finding it all comes back in returns, but also responding quickly so it doesn't keep going out of stock, because that just kills the sales figures. So we just, I think we printed 2 or 3 print runs of 5,000, and then thought, it's getting eaten before it lands, so then we went to the 20s.
And just a bit of speculative kind of questioning on my part here. Was it unusual to have a crime writer and crime fiction actually shortlisted on the Booker? Because for a long time, the crime writers have always thought the Booker was kind of untouchable, we'd go for the dagger, but no one with this kind of popular genre was going to actually be shortlisted or even longlisted for the Booker Prize.
Well, it's not a crime novel in that kind of old genre sense of the word. It is a literary novel, a full stop, and in the sense that there's sort of all kinds of crime TV programs, but the Scandi ones, the killing and so on, they're slightly different. They're much more character based, and obviously there's a plot and a crime and usually murders and so on, but they're a different kind of program. And His Bloody Project is no more of a crime novel, or no less of a crime novel, than Marlon James's History of 7 Killings, or there are any number of previous Booker listed novels that have crime woven through them. There was another one on the same long list called The North Water by, is it Philip McGuire? I've temporarily forgotten his name. It's a brilliant book, and it was a historical novel with a pretty brutal crime in it, probably more graphic than anything in His Bloody Project. But for some reason, it didn't get billed quite the same way. We just got a label on day one and just ran with it, really. So I don't think the prize in any way had changed what it was recognising. It's been a little bit more so this year when Belinda Bowers' The Snap, not The Snap, was longlisted because that's much closer to, it's a well-written one, but it's closer to a kind of genre crime novel, I think.
Now I'm going to open it up soon because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. We're just going to finish up asking you to take us through the publication process. Do you take unsolicited manuscripts? There are lots of writers here looking to place things, but maybe to take us through, if you like, for manuscript submission and whether you take unsolicited or does it go to literary agents? You used to take unsolicited kind of some years back, but I don't know if you still do now. And to take us very carefully through the whole different publication stages before you get the actual finished book.
So I could talk about this for both fiction and non-fiction, but those of you who are writers, are some of you doing non-fiction? Yes, some. And most of you doing fiction? Yes, okay, well I'll just go quickly on both. Because on non-fiction, it's much quicker to decide. First of all, yes, we take unsolicited submissions, but with the proviso that we get far, far more than we can realistically assess. But that's the same also with every agent. So we feel if we were to close unsolicited submissions, we would be closing off a massive amount of good writing. And so that's the first part of your question. When it comes to what gets to the next stage or not, it's much easier for us to make a call on non-fiction because, first of all, we know if it's something we have any expertise in or market to find and those kinds of things. So if it's a non-fiction submission, we would tend to get back quite a lot more quickly. And the first thing we would do is kind of ascertain whether it's a book that really relies on that author's expertise but perhaps needs more help with editing, or is really well written but maybe slightly dubious about the fact-checking side and so on. So there are different routines that you have to go through with non-fiction because it has to be factually fact-checked and accurate, and if it's an opinion that's way out of left field of its subject matter, then you have to have enough expertise in-house editorially to judge that and decide whether it's something you can publish. When it comes to fiction, the really hard part about it is that there are just so many very good novels that you can't publish them all. You have to somehow whittle them down, and we don't have. We've tried various different models of how we get through the reading, and very often a submission will fall at the hurdle of the submission letter, because if it's not sort of well described, or if the letter is really full of errors and so on, then you might not look very far and just decide that you can't deal with that one. And then, depending on the genre, you might read some of it in-house or read all of it. But obviously, if you could, your main focus is publishing the books that you're already doing and trying to keep an eye out for what's coming next. You can't spend all the time reading all the submissions, it's just not practical. And we don't, I know there are some small presses who sort of recruit a lot of students to do some reads. I feel that you have to be very careful and respectful of the people who've submitted to you. You can't just sort of, send them out to all kinds of people that you don't know very well. So we have a number of readers that have pledged to treat the manuscript in confidence and so on. But it's not the easiest thing to do. So we'll make a certain level of judgment but we are so sort of over. And any publisher who accepts submissions has just got too many to realistically give them all a fair shot. So, there's a bit of an element of luck as well. And then once you get to something that's very well written, you've still got to work out how to find the market. So, for example, now it would be really tricky to do another World War I book because we've had so many through all the anniversary things. And we would sometimes, in November actually, we published a book about a novel about the Ireland disaster. And it was very much helped by all of the coverage. It was a fantastic novel. It was really helped by the fact that there was going to be so much coverage of the centenary itself. And so I've got it here actually. If anyone thinks someone might want to review it for DURA, but it's on the Highland Prize long list and the shortlist announcements coming soon. So something like an anniversary or some kind of trend or something like that might help to be a vehicle for promoting that novel. So it's a difficult thing. But anyway, once you've decided and made an agreement with the author to go ahead and publish, that's when the genre becomes less of a distinction. All books will go through an editing process, which will go backwards and forwards with the author. And then when it's ready, the edit's done, it will be typeset. And then we always have another proofread at that stage. At that point, we will generally do a proof copy, a bound proof. It hardly looks any different than a finished book, but it's got details of when the book's coming out and the various things on the back and the publicist details. And then that proof is circulated to reviewers, trade, all kinds of people. And then you go into, you will have worked out a cover and upload the metadata and enthuse the sales team on what is the USP of this book and how are they going to get sales into the trade. So if they can enthuse the wholesalers will then go out and market it to individual smaller shops. And the chains are very important. I say the chains, but we mean Waterstones obviously now. And in Scotland, the Scottish buyer for Waterstones is really accessible, very supportive of small presses, and obviously if as soon as a publisher has sort of become known to the buyers enough to have a reputation for being reliable and doing things on time and getting the mechanical sides of it right, then they would be as likely to support a small press as a large press. So the book I just held up was the Waterstones Scottish Book of the Month in November, and we have a historical novel that comes out, set in Edinburgh, comes out next month, and that is going to be the Book of the Month for Blackwells in Edinburgh. So they will really get behind anything they think they can get a market for. And there's a very sort of intense phase of both marketing, coming up with ways of drawing attention to the book, but also just mechanical sales and getting orders in place and getting the distribution ready and so on. And then you get to the publication date, and then all the fun begins. Launches and lots of publicity. You aim to just get as much publicity as you can. It can be a bit tiring, I think, for the author, and especially, as you said earlier, that Graham's the only author I know who loves that side of it more than the other sides. Most authors, or at least quite a lot of authors, are quite daunted by, doing a big festival event or, presenting their book, particularly for the first time, it's quite a vulnerable position because they've created the book, but yes, they're seeing how people will respond to it for the first time. So we try and support the authors as much as we can in going through that.
And the leading time between the editorial tidying up of it and the actual publication date, just out of curiosity, how long is that? It might be 6 months a year?
It's about 6 months if you are, for a typical smaller publisher. The larger publishers will probably have more like a year, because by something like a year ahead of the actual publication date, they will produce their bound proofs and be sending them out to influencers to endorse the book. And we quite often get them sent in to us for the attention of Graham to endorse anything that's a historical or anything set in Scotland or whatever it may be. And those will often come a full year ahead of publication because people really want to get the leading writers in that, what they see as being that field, to endorse the book. And
you're thinking also of the calendar for the book calendar year, almost Christmas or the London Book Fair or all of it.
Yes, so we would be focusing on different things. So the London Book Fair and Frankfurt are rights fairs for us, but at the London Book Fair it's also a trade fair as well that our sales team are all there meeting all the main accounts, so we would have new catalogues for the autumn programme and trying to have materials for the sales team to get out and create as much fuss about the autumn titles as possible, and they're still selling the spring titles at the same time, but at a different cycle of it. So to say, for example, if there's been a certain amount of interest in a book that a modest number are being sold and it's coming out in March and book fairs in March, and then suddenly it gets on another prize, maybe not as big as the booker, but something happens to then give that book a bit of a shot in the arm, and the sales team might be going around and reminding all the buyers that this big publicity is coming, or something that can boost the sales. So there's always different phases of the selling cycle.
How many titles do you publish roughly a year?
So we do about usually six to 8 non-fiction titles, and we'll do maybe 4 literary fiction titles or literary and historical fiction. We do both of, so we'll tend to do 1 or 2 that we find maybe a little bit more edgy and contemporary. Somebody mentioned earlier, you did, I think, Ever Dundas and Goblin, and that's a really imaginative piece of writing, and she's a really huge talent. But we wouldn't have a whole list of a lot of that sort of writing. We would just want to really try and go for one, and we actually have one coming in the autumn that's in a similar sort of vein. And then we'll do probably a maximum of half a dozen for contraband, and they're a mixed bag because, as I say, we don't normally do genre crime, but this is a good moment to mention that the most conventional crime, in a way that we've done, is Claire McCleary, who is a graduate of this creative writing course. And but even so, she's brought a very different take to it, and she is a really distinctive writer, and she's going great guns. So that's very exciting. I hope someone will review it for the Dundee University Review of Arts.
Okay, one last question, and I'm just going to we'll open it up now, because I'm sure people are kind of chomping at the bits. To be a woman in publishing now, I mean, for a long time it was always thought to be a gentleman's club, but it's to be a woman in publishing now, it's easier now, for want of a better word?
Undoubtedly, yes. I mean, I know that it was very unusual for women to have influential positions in publishing. When I started, it was really only Virago, and they were still independent at the time, and also the Women's Press, which was a collective and a really one-off kind of entity at the time. And there were women with quite good positions in, for example, Penguin had, editorial, someone quite high in editorial. And there were a few, but it was rare, and it was largely dominated by men all the way through the departments, except maybe accounts and certain admin roles. But in my first job, I had to pretend to a colleague that I had no idea how to type, because he'd keep handing over things and saying, "Well, can you type this up for me?" I don't know how to do it. Because it was very much like that the roles that were most easily open to women were secretarial. And that's obviously the days of people having secretaries are long gone, the age of that. But people were, I mean, the kind of Me Too stories, I've certainly got a few examples of really, really inappropriate behaviour, and even when I told my bosses, it was kind of, just giving a slap or something. It was never taken very seriously. So thank goodness that era in all of, it's obviously not at all just publishing, it's just that publishing, like everything else, was not a very female-friendly environment. And now I think it's almost probably one of the best industries, because it's so female-dominated. And it's sad to say it, but that's partly because it's traditionally not been very well paid. And so I think, I've certainly known a lot of men over the years who joined the industry and then thought, I'm just going to go and do PR or something where I can make loads of money or make a living. So I think that is a not very nice aspect of it. But in terms of power structures, everyone knows that the statistics of reading are that there are a lot more women than men readers. And gradually it has worked through the system, so that there are women in top roles at every level of all the companies now, from the tiniest presses to the big corporates. So that's really transformed, and I don't think it's likely to be a barrier. That gender is likely to be a barrier to any job now in publishing.
Okay, thank you.